My son's DNA proved he was mine, but the result exposed a secret that destroyed my family. The DNA results came back clean. 100% match. Chukundera was his son. No doubt, no question. The science was clear. But the secret the test exposed had nothing to do with the boy's father. It had everything to do with his mother. And when the truth finally came out, it didn't just destroy a marriage, it destroyed 3 families, erased a lineage that had stood for 60 years, and left one old man sitting alone in a compound that used to overflow with children, wondering how a single lie told the night of a funeral had grown into something that swallowed them all whole. If you've never heard a story that made you question everything you thought you knew about family, stay right here. And if you are new to this channel, hit that subscribe button now, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here, the kind that stays with you long after it's over. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Ugochukwu Nofo was not a man who asked questions. That was his reputation in Unwei. A quiet man, a patient man, the kind of man who watched the rain from his veranda without needing to comment on it. His wife, Adachioma, used to say that God had made Ugo to absorb the world, not interrogate it. She said it like a compliment. Later, she would understand it was the very thing that allowed the secret to breathe and grow for 11 years without him noticing a single thing. They had been married for 13 years when everything unraveled. 13 years of what from the outside looked like a solid Igbo home. 3 children, a concrete house in a compound that Ugochukwu had built with his own savings and his father's land. A car, not brand new, but respectable. A wife who cooked with firewood on Sundays because she said gas didn't give the soup the right taste. A husband who never raised his hand, never raised his voice above what the walls could absorb. From the outside, Ugochukwu Nofo was winning. From the inside, he was a man who had been quietly afraid for 11 years and had never understood why. The fear had no name, no cause. It was just there, in the way Adachioma sometimes looked at their son Chukundera and then looked away quickly, like the boy's face contained something she wasn't ready to see. In the way she had, 11 years ago, insisted they name the boy themselves, without consulting the dibia, without the usual family ceremony. She said she had a dream. She said the name came to her. She said these things with a steadiness that Ugochukwu, being the kind of man he was, had simply accepted. He was not a man who asked questions. But in the 12th year of their marriage, his younger brother Obiechina came back to Lagos, freshly educated, freshly opinionated, and with a new obsession, DNA testing. Obiechina had done his own, just for curiosity, he said, and now he wouldn't stop talking about it. The ancestry percentages, the health markers, the certainty of genetic truth. He talked about it at dinner. He talked about it in the family meetings Ugochukwu's father still held every first Saturday of the month. He talked about it in the car, on the drive to church, until Ugochukwu finally said, mostly to silence him, "Okay, fine, we'll do it." He didn't expect anything. He was not a suspicious man. He simply wanted his brother to stop talking. The results came back 14 days later. Chukundera Nofo, age 11. Father, Ugochukwu Chukwuma Nofo. Match, 99.97%. Ugochukwu read the paper and felt nothing but mild satisfaction. The same satisfaction a man feels when he checks if the tap is off and confirms yes, the tap is off. He almost threw the paper away. Almost. But Obiechina, who had driven him to the testing center, who had paid for half the kit because he was so enthusiastic, Obiechina read the results with a different expression. Not relief, not celebration. A strange, slow stillness that Ugochukwu noticed but did not immediately understand. "What?" Ugochukwu asked. Obiechina said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Ugochukwu, did you read all of it?" He hadn't. He had read the confirmation and stopped. He didn't read the ancestry breakdown. He didn't read the extended family matches, the feature the testing company offered that showed you other people in their database who shared your DNA. He read it now, and there, listed under potential family matches, was a name he did not recognize. Odinakachi Umeora. Predicted relationship, half-sibling, confidence very high. Ugochukwu looked at the name for a long time. He had no half-siblings. His father, Maji Celestine Nofo, had been married once to one woman, his mother, Mbeke, who had died 7 years ago. There were 4 children from that marriage and no others. No illegitimate children, no hidden branches. Celestine Nofo was the kind of man who would sooner die to admit to a child outside his home. So who was Odinakachi Umeora? And why did this person share enough DNA with Chukundera, Ugochukwu's confirmed biological son, to be flagged as a half-sibling? The math was simple, even for a man who had not studied genetics. If Chukundera was his son, and Chukundera shared DNA with Odinakachi Umeora at a half-sibling level, then Odinakachi Umeora was either a child of Ugochukwu, which was impossible, he had no other children, or Odinakachi shared DNA with Ugochukwu himself, through Ugochukwu's own parent, through blood he had always assumed was clean and known. Ugochukwu sat in the car outside the testing center for 45 minutes without speaking. Obiechina, for the first time in his life, had nothing to say. Now, before we go further, if this story already has you gripped, you are in the right place. Subscribe and turn on notifications because we don't do ordinary stories here. Now, back to Ugochukwu, sitting in that car holding a paper that had just cracked his world open. He didn't confront his father immediately. That was not how Ugochukwu Nwafor operated. He did something that surprised even Obiechina. He went home, put the papers in a drawer, cooked rice with his children, sat with Adachioma through an evening of television, and went to sleep. Obiechina called him 3 times that night. He didn't answer. He needed to think, and Ugochukwu, despite his reputation for stillness, was actually very good at thinking. He was slow, but he was thorough. He was quiet, but nothing escaped him once his attention was engaged. He lay in the dark next to his sleeping wife and reconstructed everything he knew about his father's life before the marriage. Celestine Nwafor had grown up in the village. He had moved to the city, Onitsha, in his early 20s to work in trading. He had returned in his early 30s with money, married Mbeke, built a house, had 4 children, and never left again. That was the official story, the clean story, the story Celestine had told so many times it had become geology, layered and solid and impossible to dig through without the right tool. But Ugochukwu was holding the right tool. He knew there was a period, roughly 4 years, between when his father left for Onitsha and when he returned. 4 years that nobody talked about much. 4 years in which Celestine sent money home but rarely came back himself. Ugochukwu had assumed it was the grind of building a business. Most men in that generation had disappeared into cities for years before returning with something to show for it. It was not unusual, unless, during those 4 years, something else had happened. He sent a message to the name on the paper, Odinakachi Umeora. A simple message through the testing company's platform. I received your name as a DNA match. I would like to understand how we are connected. Then he waited. 3 days passed, nothing. On the 4th day, instead of a reply from Odinakachi, he received a phone call from a number he didn't recognize. An older woman's voice, composed but shaking slightly at the edges, the way voices do when they have been bracing themselves for a call for a very long time. Are you Ugochukwu? She said. Yes, he said. Silence. Then, my name is Chidindu Umeora. Odinakachi is my son. He showed me your message. Silence. Another. I have been waiting 30 years for someone from your family to call. Ugochukwu drove to Onitsha alone. He didn't tell Adachioma. He didn't tell Obiechina. He drove 3 hours through the kind of early morning silence that belongs only to people carrying something heavy.
Chidindu Miora lived in a modest home in a neighborhood that was once prosperous and aged into quiet dignity. She was in her late 60s, small, precise in her movements, the kind of woman who has survived something enormous and reorganized her entire self around the survival. She served her water and kola nuts before she spoke. That was how she knew she had been properly raised. That was also how she knew this conversation would be everything. Your father, she said, and I were together for 3 years in Onitsha before he went back to the village. Oguchukwu said nothing. He had learned from his father how to absorb. He knew about Odinakachi, she said. I wrote to him. I sent word. He sent money once and then nothing. And then I heard he had married. She looked at the wall, not at Oguchukwu. I did not go to his village. I did not make trouble. I raised my son alone. Does Odinakachi know? Oguchukwu asked. He knows his father was a man named Celestine Nwofo from Newi. He has known since he was 15, but I told him not to search. I told him the man had another family and we should leave them in peace. She finally looked at Oguchukwu directly. You uploaded his DNA because it was a health service. He didn't know it would find you. Oguchukwu drove home with a half-brother he had never known and a father he no longer fully recognized. But that was not the end of it. That was not even the middle. Because when he got home that evening, Adachioma was standing in the kitchen, and the way she looked at him when he walked through the door, the way her eyes went slightly too wide before she composed herself, he understood in that instant that she had known he had been somewhere, that she had been afraid these past days since the DNA results arrived. Not worried in the way a wife worries when a husband is distracted. Afraid. The specific fear of someone whose secret is being hunted, even if the hunter doesn't know what he's looking for yet. He sat down at the table. He looked at her. Adachioma, he said, sit down. She sat, and the thing that happened next was not what either of them expected. He said, I found out about my father's other son today. And Adachioma, his wife, the mother of his children, the woman who cooked with firewood because gas didn't give the soup the right taste, burst into tears. Not small tears, not polite tears, tears that broke open the room. And Oguchukwu, who was not a man who asked questions, asked one now. What do you know about this? What she told him over the next 2 hours was not what he expected. Not at all. Adachioma had grown up in Onitsha. Her mother and Chidindu Umeora were neighbors. Not close, but neighbors. She had known since childhood that the woman down the road had a son whose father was a man from Newi who had abandoned them. Village gossip, the kind of thing you hear as a child without knowing it will one day matter. When Oguchukwu's family came to ask for her hand, when his father Celestine Nwofo came to her parents' compound in a starched agbada with her future in-laws, Adachioma was 19 and had recognized the name, Nwofo, from Newi. She looked at the old man and thought, is this him? Is this the man Chidindu talked about? She never confirmed it. She didn't know for certain. She married Oguchukwu and told herself it didn't matter. Old men had secrets. Her husband was not his father. She would build her own life. And she did. For 2 years, she built it beautifully.
Then she ran into Chidindung in the market, by accident. And Chidindung, who did not know who she had married, who did not know her last name had changed, spoke freely about her bitterness, still raw even after all those years. About the man from Newi, about the son he had never acknowledged. And Adachioma went home and said nothing. But the guilt of it, the knowledge that she had married into the family of the man who had destroyed Chidindun's life, the knowledge that her father-in-law sat at her table and blessed her food with hands that had once signed away a woman and child, that guilt had no place to go. It lived in her chest. It changed the quality of the air between her and Celestine when he visited. It made her tense at family meetings. It made her look at Chukwudera sometimes and see the future, see the day he would be old enough to inherit a secret she had carried alone. She had never told Ugochukwu because she had not known with certainty, because it wasn't her secret to tell, because she had told herself that silence was the kindest option. "You could have told me," Ugochukwu said when she finished. "I know," she said. "All these years," he said. "I know," she said again. "Did you think I would do nothing? Did you think I was that kind of man?" She looked at him across the table, and her answer, which she didn't give with words, but with the look itself, told him everything. She hadn't told him because she knew exactly what he would do. He would confront his father. He would demand answers. He would refuse to let the thing stay buried. And she had been afraid, not of the truth, but of what the truth would cost. The family, the compound, the first Saturday meetings, Mazi Celestine, who was old now and whose health was uncertain. She had been carrying the weight of everyone else's peace. That was the real secret. Not that she knew, but that she had chosen every day for 11 years to protect a man who had done something cruel, at the cost of her own honesty. Ugochukwu did not sleep that night. He sat on the veranda the way he always sat, absorbing the dark, but this time with a question that had no comfortable answer. He was not angry at Adachioma. He understood what she had done, even if he couldn't excuse it. What he felt was something harder than anger, a kind of grief for the marriage they could have had if she had trusted him with it, for the version of himself she had kept in the dark, for the years he had moved through his own life without knowing its full shape. He called Obiechina in the morning. Then he called his father. Mazi Celestine Nwofo received his son in the parlor of the family compound on a Thursday afternoon. He was 72 years old. His hands had the tremor that had come on in the last year. His eyes, however, were clear. They had always been clear, even now watching Ugochukwu sit down across from him with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness, more deliberate, more charged. Celestine's eyes were clear. Ugochukwu placed the DNA results on the table. He did not speak. He simply let his father look. Celestine looked at the paper for a long time, longer than necessary for a man to read a single page. He was doing what Ugochukwu had done in the car outside the testing center. He was buying time, reorganizing, preparing. "Where did you get this?" Celestine said. "I went to see Chidindu Mera in Onitsha." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing Ugochukwu had ever sat inside. Then his father said, "I sent her money." "Once," Ugochukwu said. "You sent it once." "I was building a life here," Celestine said. "I had obligations." "You had a son," Ugochukwu said. "You had a son and you walked away from him and you walked into this compound and you built a life on top of him like he was a foundation you poured concrete over." Celestine said nothing. "He is 64 years old, Papa. He grew up without a father. His mother spent 30 years waiting for you to do the right thing." Ugochukwu leaned forward. "And you sat at my table. You blessed my children. You spoke about honor and family and the Nwofo name." "Don't," Celestine said quietly. "Don't what?" Ugochukwu asked. "Don't tell you what you already know?" They sat in silence for a long time. The compound sounds came through the window. Children somewhere, a generator starting up 2 houses away, a woman calling a name. Finally, Celestine said, "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to meet your son." The old man's jaw tightened. "That is not, I am not asking," Ugochukwu said, and the quietness in his voice was a different kind of quiet than the one he had always carried. It was not the quiet of a man who doesn't ask questions. It was the quiet of a man who has finally asked the only question that matters and is no longer interested in deflection. They brought Odinakachi Omera to the compound on a Saturday, not the first Saturday. Ugochukwu did not have the heart for that, not yet, but a quiet Saturday in the middle of the month.
Chidindun came too. She stood in the compound of the man who had abandoned her, 60 years old and upright, wearing a dark green wrapper and a face that had composed itself into something beyond bitterness. She was not there for herself. She was there for her son. Odinakachi was a tall man, lean. He stood in the entrance to the compound and looked around the walls, the trees, the space his father had built, the space he had been excluded from, with an expression that Ugochukwu could not quite read. Not anger, not hunger, something older. The look of a man who has spent a lifetime imagining a place and has finally been given permission to see whether the reality matches the image. It did not. No imagined place ever does.
Celestine met him in the parlor. The old man could not stand without the arm of a chair. Odinakachi stopped in the doorway. Father and son looked at each other across decades and silence and the specific damage that comes from a man choosing himself over his own blood. Celestine opened his mouth. What he had prepared to say, Ugochukwu didn't know. An apology, perhaps, a justification, something carved and polished by the hours of the night. What came out was, "You look like my own father." Odinakachi stared at him for a long time. Then he said, "I know, my mother showed me a photograph once." The room was very still. Then Odinakachi crossed to a chair and sat down, and Celestine, after a moment, let go of the armrest and sat down across from him. And two men who shared blood but not a single memory began the slow, painful work of speaking to each other. Ugochukwu stood in the doorway and watched. Obiechina stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. Now, I know what you are thinking. You are thinking, is that the end? Is that the secret? The grandfather's hidden son? It isn't. Hold on. And while you're holding on, if you've been watching this long and you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Not because I'm telling you to, but because you know this kind of storytelling is rare and you don't want to miss what's next. Because what happened 3 weeks after Odinakachi came to the compound, that is where the story turns into something neither Ugochukwu nor anyone else in that family ever saw coming. It was Adachioma who found it. Not looking for it, not searching. She was cleaning, the deep cleaning she did at the end of every month, the kind that involves moving furniture and reaching into places that haven't been touched in years. She was in the parlor, and she moved the old cabinet that had been in the corner since before they were married. The cabinet that came with the house, that no one used, that stored nothing but dust and 3 old calendars. And behind it, taped to the wall with yellowed Scotch tape, was an envelope. She almost didn't open it. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was old, clearly. The tape had dried and curled at the edges. It could be anything, an old document, a forgotten note. She opened it. Inside was a letter, handwritten, in a woman's handwriting, dated 31 years ago. Adachioma read it once, standing in the parlor. Then she sat down on the floor and read it again. The letter was from a woman named Mbeke Mwofo, Ugochukwu's mother, dead 7 years. The letter was addressed to Celestine, and it began, "If you are reading this, then I am already gone, and the truth has lived long enough. I have carried this since before Ugochukwu was born, and I will not take it to the grave without writing it down." Adachioma called Ugochukwu from the parlor. Her voice was steady, the steadiness of someone in shock who hasn't broken yet. He read the letter 3 times. His mother, Mbeke, patient, devout, compound managing Mbeke, had known about Odinakachi from the very beginning. From before the marriage, she had known because, unlike her husband, she had made it her business to know. When Celestine came back from Onitsha and began the preparation for marriage, Mbeke had heard rumors, the market network of women who know everything, and she had quietly confirmed them.
A woman in Onitsha, a child, a man who was pretending the past was finished. She had confronted Celestine before the wedding, not publicly, privately, and Celestine had promised, had sworn that it was finished, that the woman knew that arrangements had been made. He had lied. But that was not the worst of it. The worst of it, the part that made Ugochukwu's hands shake for the first time in his adult life, was what Mbeke had done next. Mbeke had gone to Onitsha herself, alone, without her husband's knowledge. She had found Chidindu. She had looked at the baby, Odinakachi, barely a year old, and she had made Chidindu an offer. Not a cruel offer, not a dismissal. A woman who understood what it meant to be abandoned with a child. She had given Chidindu money, real money, her savings, the ones she kept separately from the household account, the ones she had told no one about. She had given it to Chidindu and said, "This is not to silence you. This is because my husband should have done this and he will not. Take it, raise your son. If you need more, send word to this address." And she had given Chidindu an address, a post box that was separate from the family compound. Chidindu had taken the money. She had sent word twice over the years, and twice, quietly, Mbeke had responded. Not Celestine, Mbeke. For 30 years, the woman who everyone thought was simply standing by her husband had actually been running a quiet, separate operation of conscience. She had been cleaning up after him, ensuring that the child he had abandoned was not entirely forsaken, carrying the weight of his sin on her own back, without credit, without acknowledgement, without anyone knowing. And she had written it down in a letter, taped it behind a cabinet because she could not die without it existing somewhere. She had known Ugochukwu would not think to look behind the cabinet. She had known Celestine would not touch that parlor. She put it there for no one specific, or perhaps for everyone eventually, for the time when the secret would surface on its own, as secrets eventually do, and someone would need to understand the full shape of what had happened.
Ugochukwu sat with the letter in his lap for a very long time. His mother, who had died believing the truth would stay hidden long enough, who had prayed every Sunday with a face of perfect composure, who had fed everyone in that compound without complaint and held the family together with the ordinary steel of women who are never credited for the work of holding. She had known, and she had not been passive. She had acted, quietly, at cost to herself, without witnesses. And Celestine, who had accepted her silent management of her failure as his right, who had never, in 30 years of living with the woman who had covered for him, acknowledged what she had done, who had perhaps convinced himself over time that it was simply the way things were. Ugochukwu put the letter down. He looked at Adachioma. "Your mother knew," Adachioma said quietly. "Yes," he said. "She was a good woman," Adachioma said. She was. She was also completely alone in it. The silence between them was different from all the silences before. Not the silence of avoided questions, not the silence of kept secrets, the silence of two people arriving together at the same understanding. Ugochukwu had kept a secret for 11 years. Mbeke had kept hers for 30. Both of them had absorbed something they should have been able to put down. "I should have told you," Adachioma said. Not for the first time, but this time she meant something slightly different by it. "Yes," Ugochukwu said, "and you should not have had to carry it alone." What happened next took months. Ugochukwu brought the letter to his father. Celestine read it, and for the first and only time in Ugochukwu's life, he watched his father cry. Not dignified tears, the other kind. The kind that come from a man who has spent decades building a monument to his own correctness and has finally been shown the thing he buried in the foundation. Celestine said, "She never told me she went." "No," Ugochukwu said, "she knew you would find a way to stop it." The old man had no answer to that.
Odinakachi was told about the letter. He read it in the compound, standing under the mango tree, and then stood quietly for a long moment. Then he said to no one in particular, "She was the one who sent the money." Chinindu had always told him an anonymous benefactor had helped them. She had never said it was the first wife. She hadn't known herself. "You knew my name," Odinakachi said. "You knew exactly who I was. You just couldn't acknowledge me publicly without destroying everything." Odinakachi looked up. His expression was not angry, not relieved, something more complicated. The look of a man who has just discovered that the story he's been telling himself about his abandonment was missing a character. That he had been abandoned by a father, yes, but quietly, secretly, he had also been seen by a mother who was not his own. "He didn't have to do that," he said. "No," Ugochukwu said. "He didn't." Chinindu came to the compound one more time, on a Sunday. She sat in the parlor where the letter had been found, and she spoke to Celestine directly for the first time in 30 years. What passed between them, the children were not in the room to hear. That was right. Some reckonings belong only to the people inside them. They were in there for 40 minutes. When Chinindu came out, she looked lighter. Not healed. Some wounds don't heal. They just stop being open. But lighter. The way a person looks when they finally put down something they didn't realize they were still carrying. She shook Ugochukwu's hand at the gate. She looked at him for a moment and said, "Your mother was a remarkable woman." "I know," he said. "I'm only now learning how much." The family did not explode the way everyone had feared. There were hard conversations. There were family members who did not take it well, cousins who felt the lineage had been shamed, an uncle who suggested the whole thing should have been left buried. Obiechina, typically, had too many opinions. There were weeks where the compound felt fragile, like a bond that had been reset but hadn't finished healing. But they held. Odinakachi did not move into the compound. He had his own life, his own home, his own children. He didn't need a father. He was 64 years old and had built himself without one. What he needed was simply to be acknowledged, to exist in the official map of this family, to not be a secret anymore. He came for the first Saturday meeting 2 months after everything came out. He sat at the table where Mazi Celestine presided, with Ugochukwu on one side and Obiechina on the other, and nobody pretended that it was comfortable. But he was there. He was counted. That was what Mbeki had wanted. Ugochukwu was sure of it now. She had known the secret would survive her. She had known Celestine would not move without being forced. She had taped that letter to the wall because she had trusted that eventually someone would clean thoroughly enough to find it. She had trusted the slow, ordinary walk of time.
Ugochukwu and Adachioma are still married. That is not a small thing, and he knows it. What she had done, the 11 years of carried silence, had cost them something they could not get back. A version of their marriage that was fully honest. He grieved that, quietly, on the veranda, in the way he processed everything. He let himself grieve it, and then he let it go. Because here is the thing that the DNA test had actually proven. Not the paternity, not the ancestry, not the biological accuracy of who belonged to whom. What it had proven was that secrets in families are not discreet. They are not contained in the people who make them. They seep. They travel through generations, through women who didn't create them, through children who don't know they are carrying them, through the silences of quiet men who stop asking questions. And the only way to end them is to refuse, eventually, to hold them alone. Ugochukwu learned that from his mother, from a letter taped behind a cabinet in a parlor, written by a woman who had no audience for her conscience except the future. He learned it from Adachioma too, not from what she had done wrong, but from watching what it had cost her, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been protecting everyone else's peace at the expense of their own. He learned it from Odinakachi, who stood under the mango tree and received the news that he had been quietly seen by a woman he never met, and who cried, not from grief, but from the strange specific relief of knowing that he had been entirely invisible.
The boy, Chukudera, is 12 now. He knows his grandfather has a son he didn't know about. He knows his family had a secret. He doesn't know all of it. He's 12, there is time. But he knows that his father went looking for something small and found something enormous, and that the family survived. He asks questions. That is his nature, not like his father, who absorbed, but like his grandmother Ngeke, who went quietly to Onitsha alone with her savings and her conscience and her stubborn refusal to let an injustice be entirely invisible. Ugochukwu learned that from his mother, from a letter taped behind a cabinet in a parlor, written by a woman who had no audience for her conscience except the future. He learned it from Adachioma too, not from what she had done wrong, but from watching what it had cost her. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been protecting everyone else's peace at the expense of their own. He learned it from Odnakachia, who stood under the mango tree and received the news that he had been quietly seen by a woman he never met, and who cried, not from grief, but from the strange specific relief of knowing that he had been entirely invisible. This kind of story stays with you, not because of the drama, though there was plenty, but because of what it says about the women who hold families together in silence and what it costs them, about the secrets that travel through bloodlines not as curses, but as unfinished truths, waiting for someone patient enough to finish them. Ngege Nwofo made her choice 30 years before anyone would understand it. Her son is only beginning to. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own family, the things you know, the things you carry, the things taped behind cabinets in rooms you haven't cleaned yet, then you are exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe, turn on notifications. We tell these stories because they matter, because families are not simple, and the truth, when it finally comes, is almost always more complicated and more human than anyone expected. We'll see you in the next one.